and is instructed to take the oath of office immediately. He reluctantly calls the only local judge available, Sarah Hughes. Johnson vetoed her appointment to the federal bench, but now he must ask her to swear him in as president. Johnson personally phones 3 lawyers in Dallas. No one has the text of the presidential oath to hand. There are also no sound and motion cameras to record the moment. One of Kilduff's press agents finds a dictaphone with 1 spare recording belt. A professional stills camera is also brought on board. 2 very basic machines will immortalize one of the most important events in American history. Finally, the Attorney General dictates the words of the ceremony over the telephone from Washington. President Kennedy's body is loaded onto Air Force One as Judge Hughes arrives. 5 minutes later, Lyndon Johnson begins the ceremony that will make him president. Malcolm Kilduff, crouched at Johnson's feet, operates the dictaphone. Still, silent, and in shock, Jackie Kennedy acts as witness to the event.
I solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. And will to the best of my ability.
With the new President Johnson on board, Air Force One takes off from Love Field, Dallas. 2.5 hours later, the plane lands at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, where President Kennedy took off for Texas yesterday morning. The casket is removed from the plane, and Jackie rides with it into Washington. She is still wearing the pink blood-soaked dress and stockings, caked in her husband's blood. At 6:15 p.m., President Lyndon Johnson addresses the world for the first time.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do.
On Monday, next week, John Kennedy Jr. will mark his 3rd birthday, and on Wednesday, his sister Caroline will be 6. Deeply shaken by their experiences of the day, the Newman brothers will sleep on the floor of their parents' room for days afterwards. The family will never return to Dealey Plaza. Dr. Malcolm Perry will later move to Washington, D.C. as professor of surgery. He returned to Southwestern Medical School in 1996. 2 years after President Kennedy's death, Malcolm Kilduff left the White House to set up his own news agency. He later edited a local newspaper and died in March 2003. 2 days after Kennedy's death, the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, is himself gunned down in a Dallas City jail. He dies the day before JFK's funeral.
If a beachhead of cooperation may push back the jungle of suspicion, let both sides join in creating a new endeavor where the strong are just and the weak secure and the peace preserved. All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet, but let us begin.
It is the 8th of August, 1974. At the Geneva Peace Conference, negotiations continue on the future of Cyprus. In Belfast, Northern Ireland, vehicles are set alight in protest at the British government's internment policy. In Buenos Aires, Eva Perón is sworn in as interim leader of Argentina. And in Washington, D.C., President Richard Nixon is to be impeached following his role in the Watergate break-in. 10:45 a.m., the White House, Washington. 51-year-old Ollie Atkins loads his cameras with 2 rolls of black and white film. Ollie has been ordered to get over to the Oval Office as quickly as possible. A meeting will take place at 11 o'clock between the Vice President and the President. Richard Milhous Nixon, 37th President of the United States. Ollie is the White House chief photographer. Today will be the biggest day of his career. This morning, the White House is under siege. Political aides and party workers face a major crisis. The press are camped out everywhere. Yesterday, it was announced that President Nixon is to be impeached. He will be tried by the US Senate for high crimes and misdemeanors. The charges stem from his involvement in a political scandal known as Watergate. At stake, the presidency itself, his political career, and even his freedom. Ollie gets to the Oval Office early and arranges for a White House assistant to turn the lights up on a signal from him when the Vice President arrives. These will be the most historic photographs you will ever take, he has been told. Meanwhile, on the other side of the White House in the Nixon family residence, Manolo Sanchez is emptying drawers. He has been valet to Richard Nixon for 13 years. His wife, Fina, is the personal maid to First Lady Pat Nixon. Vice President Gerald Ford arrives, and Ollie waits with him outside the Oval Office. He follows him in a minute later, and the president turns to him. "How do you want us, Ollie?" he asks.
Please, Mr. Ford.
The president is smiling. Ollie asks him to be more serious. Nixon and Ford discuss how to respond to the current impeachment crisis. The president's career has been something of a roller coaster ride, but right now, his prospects look bleak. Richard Nixon launched his bid for the presidency way back in 1960, but he lost a close-run race to the emerging John F. Kennedy. He then proclaimed the end of his political ambitions when he lost the election for governor of California 2 years later.
I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
But, ever the political opportunist, Nixon bounced back in 1968 when he won the presidency on the pledge of ending the war in Vietnam.
The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. This honor now beckons America.
11:30 a.m., and Nixon continues his meeting with Ford. The president still believes he can salvage his reputation despite his pending impeachment. Others disagree, including some of his oldest friends and political allies who now begin to publicly desert him.
I am prepared to conclude that the magnificent public career of Richard Nixon must be terminated involuntarily.
It seems Nixon's luck has run out. He has been a president with the knack of being in the right place at the right time. In his first term, he welcomed home America's first men on the moon, though it had been Presidents Kennedy and Johnson who had put them there. But Nixon was also the architect of significant milestones in Cold War diplomacy. In 1972, he was the first American president to ever visit China and Moscow. At the very moment Nixon was enjoying his greatest political achievement, the seeds of his eventual downfall were being sown. Reports were emerging of a seemingly insignificant break-in at the Watergate building in Washington. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught installing bugging devices in the offices of the Democratic Party in the Watergate complex. 2 of the men had CIA connections. Another was James McCord, Nixon's Republican security chief.
Justice will be pursued fairly, fully, and impartially, no matter who is involved.
11:45 a.m., and Vice President Ford leaves the Oval Office. He has a momentous day ahead of him. If Nixon is forced out of power, then Ford will assume the presidency. But Richard Nixon has proved his ability to fight his way back when the political odds seem stacked against him. 22 years ago, he fought a charge of embezzlement while standing for election.
I don't believe that I ought to quit, because I'm not a quitter.
Encouraged by intense coverage by the Washington Post, the FBI began to investigate following the Watergate burglary in 1972. But Nixon himself seemed untouched by it. He was re-elected the same year with the biggest landslide in U.S. history. Just days after Nixon celebrated his re-election, the 5 Watergate burglars and 2 accomplices went to trial and to prison in January 1973. Nixon was still at a safe distance, the hero of the hour for negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam. 12:15 p.m. Ollie Atkins races ahead of the president to the Executive Office building. Nixon walks across 5 minutes later. He's due to meet with his personal lawyer to discuss his options. The crowds are building up outside the White House following yesterday's impeachment announcement. The media are campaigning for and anticipating Nixon's resignation. The political climate remains tense. Last October, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned over charges of tax evasion. His was not the only resignation of 1973. The Domestic Affairs Assistant, John Ehrlichman, resigned pending trial for obstruction of justice. And most damaging of all, the Attorney General John Mitchell, apparently the ringleader of the Watergate bugging team, was forced to quit.
We have faced other crises in our history, and we have become stronger by rejecting the easy way out and taking the right way in meeting our challenges. Our greatness as a nation has been our capacity to do what has to be done when we knew our course was right.
Newspaper investigations have revealed trails of dirty money and espionage linking the Watergate burglars to the White House. Nixon himself has been implicated. The noose is tightening. Ollie waits outside the president's office. He's not invited in. The president is meeting his personal lawyer. For 2 years, Nixon has claimed there had been no attempt to prevent the FBI's investigation of the Watergate break-in.
We must maintain the integrity of the White House. And that integrity must be real, not transparent. There can be no whitewash at the White House.
But a taped conversation has revealed that there was a whitewash. Only a week after the break-in, Nixon and Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman colluded to block the FBI investigation of Watergate. This taped conversation is the smoking gun that finally proves Nixon's direct involvement in the Watergate cover-up. Richard Nixon is now considering his position. The president leaves the executive building. Already facing impeachment and the threat of legal action, Richard Nixon has decided to resign. He will be the first American president to resign from office. White House staff are briefed in the White House Theater by the Chief of Staff, Alexander Haig. The president walks through the corridors of the White House.
The West Wing was strangely quiet. Desks that had never been uncluttered were cleared. Only the steady ringing of the phones gave the place a sense of purpose, of life. Everything else seemed frozen.
Manolo Sanchez is preparing the president's lunch. He takes a special pride in it today. Cottage cheese and pineapple and a glass of milk. He insists on taking it across to the president personally. The president is taking a nap. He skips Manolo's lunch. Ollie takes a snap of it, feeling that every moment, every detail is now historic. Richard Nixon's last White House meal. Ollie shares a club sandwich with Manolo at lunchtime. The valet makes his anguish clear. Richard Nixon had endorsed the Sanchez couple's naturalization in 1968 down in Florida. They are still proud to serve the president.
When he gets worked up, he keeps lapsing into Spanish, and nobody knows what he's talking about. And he kept on going in a marathon English-Spanish talking jag.
Nixon spends the afternoon locked away, writing his speech, the resignation speech. He will broadcast live to the nation at 9 this evening. Raymond K. Price, Jr. is also working on the president's speech. He's been on the staff for 7 years and wrote Nixon's inaugural speech in 1969. Tonight's address will be typed in large print letters so the president can read it on television without glasses. Nixon takes a walk in the White House Rose Garden. He did the same thing yesterday afternoon with his daughter, Tricia. She had been married here 3 years ago. Today, Nixon has instructed the press secretary to keep everyone away from him. Snappers grab illicit photographs anyway. Nixon shaves and takes a shower as Manolo lays out his suit. It's the same one he wore in Moscow in 1972 when speaking on Russian television. Slate blue with light texture. Cooler, he thinks, for wearing under hot TV lights. The full significance of this choice is only revealed later. Nixon leaves Manolo and the White House family quarters. Outside the nearby gates, the public throng has grown. Most are angry at the president. Some are apparently singing America in support of him. He walks on to the executive building without acknowledging anyone. The countdown to the speech has begun. An hour and a half to go. Official business. Nixon meets the 5 congressional leaders to inform them that he has decided to resign.
I took a look around the office. My eyes ran over the familiar elephants, the gavels, the framed cartoons, and the pictures of Pat and Tricia and Julie. I walked out and closed the door behind me. I knew that I would not be back there again.
Half an hour later, an hour until airtime, Nixon meets 46 friends and supporters in the cabinet room. Nixon mentions that he will fly home to California tomorrow and will have the black briefcase with the presidential nuclear launch codes with him until Air Force One lands in California. The president is unaware that Defense Secretary James R. Schlesinger, a so-called supporter, will have removed the briefcase from the aircraft. He has also instructed the Joint Chiefs of Staff that any order for military movement from the White House must be countersigned by him. The Schlesinger Protectorate is intended to impede any last-minute military coup by President Nixon. Ollie Atkins is preparing to photograph the president's speech. 2 rolls, color and black and white. He is standing in the corridor as Nixon leaves the cabinet room, saying to his friends, "I just hope I haven't let you down." Outside the White House gates, the public are anticipating the president's address. Inside the White House, the staff gather around television sets as they await the president's speech. The president is taken to a room adjacent to the Oval Office for makeup prior to the broadcast at 9. He remembers refusing makeup for the presidential candidates debate with Kennedy back in '60. He looked terrible. Some still say this is why he lost that year.
We know what peace demands. We will keep America the strongest nation in the world, and we will couple that strength with firm diplomacy.
The president knows he has destroyed himself. He installed the secret White House taping system that revealed his complicity in the Watergate cover-up. He had recorded himself, planning it with his chief of staff a week after the 1972 break-in.
The problem are because the FBI is not under control because Ray doesn't exactly know how to control it. And just say a lot of this terminology when you work on that's not unusual development. Because it is very incremental to have this thing going further. There's involved in Cubas and play a cut the way they play, and that's what we're going to play. Okay.
The president was forced to release the tape of this conversation only 2 weeks ago. It's evidence that he has lied, and it could yet send him to prison.
Those acts cannot be defended. Those who were guilty of abuses must be punished.
Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman resigned last autumn over Watergate and now stands to go to jail for obstruction of justice and perjury. Nixon could face the same fate at the hands of Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski. Some of the best writing has been done in jail, Nixon quips to his lawyer, masking a real fear of prison.
To most of us, Watergate has come to mean not just a burglary and bugging of party headquarters, but a whole series of acts that either represent or appear to represent an abuse of trust.
Nixon is overwrought, and the makeup girl is asked to leave while he regains his composure. 8:58 p.m. The president sits down behind the desk in the Oval Office. Ollie usually takes snaps before or after a speech, but wants it real and live this time. The president reluctantly agrees. As the shutter clicks repeatedly, Nixon is very nervous and makes jokes and comments which no one reacts to. Without realizing it, he is wearing the same suit and tie he was wearing when the Watergate burglary took place in June 1972. Manolo is in the kitchen with the staff watching television. All over the White House, staff gather around television sets to witness the president's historic address. At exactly 9:01 p.m., President Nixon addresses the nation for the last time.
In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation.
110 million people across America are watching. 40 million are listening to the radio.
Throughout the speech, I looked down at the pages of the text, but I did not really read it. That speech was truly in my heart.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body.
Ollie shifts onto the porch and photographs the president through the window in the middle of the speech. Nixon does not acknowledge any guilt over Watergate, but says he will be too distracted by the scandal to be an effective leader.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford.
9:16 p.m.
Be sworn in as president.
Nixon finishes the speech without breaking down. He is sweating profusely, so much so that his suit is wringing wet. He jokes with the TV crew, who stand respectfully silent around him. The president hands out old election souvenirs to the camera operators. "Well, that's what's left, boys," he says. The president makes his way over to the family residence to be with his family. There were pictures yesterday evening of a similar emotional gathering. Tonight, Ollie has not been invited. Outside, the crowd chants, "Jail to the chief." The family departs, and Manolo brings the president bacon and eggs in the Lincoln sitting room. He leaves the room, but hovers near in case the president needs him. Nixon starts making phone calls. Meanwhile, Two of the Watergate prosecution team are preparing a formal recommendation for Nixon's arrest following his departure tomorrow.
In any organization, the man at the top must bear the responsibility. That responsibility, therefore, belongs here, in this office. I accept it.
Nixon awakes thinking it's 4:30. 2 hours early, he gets up anyway to fix himself a snack. He's surprised to find Manolo already up. And the two men quickly discover that the president's watch must have stopped during the night. Time is still ticking for Richard Nixon. Nixon is working on the morning address to the White House staff. Chief of Staff General Al Haig enters the Lincoln Room with the president's resignation letter. Surrounded with the memoirs of past presidents, Nixon signs his name. He has been president for just over 2,000 days. While Nixon completes his final duties, his fate is about to be determined. Special